In the American system of government, the relationship between federal and state authority operates on principles carefully crafted by the framers of the Constitution. Federal law enforcement agencies wield considerable power, investigating crimes that cross state lines and threatening national interests. State courts maintain jurisdiction over matters explicitly reserved to the states under the 10th Amendment. Most federal agents understand this delicate balance. They recognize that while their badge grants them authority within specific federal domains, it does not exempt them from state laws that fall within legitimate state police powers. But occasionally, an agent forgets this fundamental principle. Years of federal authority convince them that their badge grants immunity from the laws that govern ordinary citizens. When this happens in the presence of a judge who understands constitutional law better than they do, the consequences can be swift, devastating, and career-ending. This is the story of one such agent, a man whose 18 years with the FBI convinced him that his federal credentials placed him above state judicial authority. What transpired in Judge Frank Caprio's Providence courtroom on a Monday morning would become a defining case study in constitutional boundaries, federal-state relations, and the dangers of confusing investigative authority with legal immunity. Special Agent Marcus Webb had spent 18 years with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, working primarily in the white-collar crime division. His career had been solid, if unremarkable. Competent investigative work, adequate courtroom testimony, sufficient case closures to avoid scrutiny, but insufficient to earn promotion beyond his current GS-13 pay grade. What Webb lacked in career advancement, he compensated for with an inflated sense of federal superiority. He had developed the peculiar arrogance that sometimes afflicts federal agents who spend years being the most powerful person in virtually every interaction. Witnesses defer to them. Local police departments coordinate with them. Suspects fear them, and attorneys negotiate carefully around them. This constant deference had convinced Webb that his federal badge granted him a status separate from and superior to ordinary citizens. He had begun to view state and local laws as inconveniences that applied to civilians but not to federal law enforcement personnel like himself. This worldview would prove catastrophic. 4 weeks before his court appearance, Webb had been driving his personal vehicle, a late-model luxury sedan, to a dentist appointment. Running late and preoccupied with reviewing case files on his phone at stoplights, he accelerated through a residential neighborhood without noticing the school zone signs. A Rhode Island state trooper, positioned near the elementary school monitoring traffic during dismissal hours, clocked Webb at 50 miles per hour in a clearly marked 25-mile-per-hour school zone. Children were crossing with crossing guards. Parents were collecting their children. The violation was egregious and dangerous. When the trooper activated his lights and pulled Webb over, the FBI agent's initial response was not contrition but indignation. He immediately produced his federal credentials, along with his driver's license, expecting the trooper to recognize the implicit message: federal agents don't get traffic tickets. The state trooper, to his credit, was unimpressed. "Agent Webb, I understand you're with the FBI, but you were doing 50 in a school zone during school hours. That's extremely dangerous." Webb's response revealed his fundamental misunderstanding of constitutional authority. "Officer, I'm a federal law enforcement agent. I maintain operational readiness requirements that necessitate flexible interpretation of local traffic restrictions." The trooper paused, processing this remarkable assertion. "Sir, are you telling me you were on official FBI business?" "I maintain federal authority at all times," Webb replied, which was both legally meaningless and personally revealing. The trooper, demonstrating more constitutional knowledge than the federal agent, issued the citation, $400 plus court costs, with a mandatory court appearance due to the severity of the violation. Webb accepted the ticket with visible contempt, certain that his federal status would resolve the matter once he appeared before whatever local judge handled such trivial matters. Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom in Providence Municipal Court handles thousands of cases each year. Traffic violations, parking disputes, minor infractions that form the routine machinery of urban governance. Most defendants appear with resignation, pay their fines, and return to their lives with slightly lighter wallets and marginally improved driving habits. Monday, November 6th, began typically. Judge Caprio arrived at his customary hour, reviewed his docket, and prepared for a day of routine proceedings. The case of Special Agent Marcus Webb appeared unremarkable on paper, a speeding violation in a school zone, with the defendant holding federal law enforcement credentials. What the docket didn't reveal was that this would become one of the most significant constitutional confrontations in the court's history. At 9:15 a.m., the courtroom doors opened with unusual force. Special Agent Webb strode in wearing an expensive tailored suit, his federal badge prominently displayed on his belt, his entire bearing radiating the supreme confidence of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room. His body language immediately signaled problems ahead. He didn't remove his badge upon entering the courtroom. He positioned himself at the defendant's stand, as though he were conducting an interrogation rather than answering charges. His expression conveyed not concern about the proceeding, but annoyance at having to attend it at all. Judge Caprio observed all of this with the practiced eye of someone who had spent 35 years reading human behavior. Special Agent Marcus Webb, the court clerk announced, reading from the docket. Webb stepped forward, his federal credentials catching the courtroom lights as he positioned himself with theatrical authority. Judge Caprio looked up from his paperwork. Agent Webb, you're charged with exceeding the speed limit in a school zone, 50 miles per hour in a 25-mile-per-hour zone during school hours. This violation of Rhode Island state law occurred on October 22nd at 2:15 p.m. How do you plead? Webb's response immediately signaled that this would not be a routine proceeding. Your Honor, he said, his voice carrying unmistakable condescension. I'm pleading not guilty because this citation represents a fundamental misunderstanding of federal law enforcement operational authorities and jurisdictional precedents. Judge Caprio set down his pen, never a positive sign for defendants attempting to lecture him about law. Agent Webb, were you conducting official FBI business at the time of the violation? Not at that specific moment, Your Honor, but as a federal law enforcement agent. I maintain certain operational readiness requirements and jurisdictional authorities that supersede local traffic enforcement applications. The courtroom became noticeably quieter. Webb had just claimed that his federal badge exempted him from state traffic laws, even while conducting personal business. Agent Webb, were you responding to a federal emergency or operating under federal directive? Webb's irritation became visible. Your Honor, federal agents operate under different legal frameworks than local law enforcement. We maintain federal authority that requires operational flexibility, not subject to municipal restrictions. Judge Caprio's expression remained neutral, but veteran court watchers recognized the subtle signs of a judge preparing to deliver a constitutional education. Agent Webb, can you cite the specific federal statute or Supreme Court precedent that exempts FBI agents from state traffic laws when conducting personal business? Webb paused, clearly unprepared for this level of constitutional scrutiny from a municipal court judge. Your Honor, federal supremacy doctrine establishes that federal law enforcement operations take precedence over local ordinances. The silence that followed was profound. Webb had just misapplied one of the Constitution's most fundamental principles, while demonstrating alarming ignorance of jurisdictional law. But Webb wasn't finished compounding his error. Your Honor, he continued, his tone suggesting he was explaining elementary concepts to someone of limited understanding. I've been a federal agent for 18 years. I think I understand how federal jurisdiction works better than a municipal court judge who deals primarily with local parking tickets and minor infractions. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Webb had just insulted Judge Caprio's understanding of federal law and suggested that municipal court experience was inferior to federal law enforcement work. What Webb did next would transform an already serious situation into career suicide. He reached for his federal badge, unclipped it from his belt, and held it up toward Judge Caprio with obvious theatrical intent. Your Honor, this badge represents the authority of the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the United States Department of Justice. I think that carries more weight than local traffic enforcement. Webb had just flashed his federal credentials at a sitting state judge, explicitly suggesting that federal law enforcement authority superseded state judicial authority. He had crossed a constitutional line from which there would be no return. Judge Caprio slowly stood from his bench, an unprecedented gesture that signaled something extraordinary was about to occur. He removed his glasses with deliberate precision and looked directly at Webb with an expression of calm, measured authority. "Agent Webb," the judge said, his voice remaining perfectly controlled but carrying unmistakable judicial power. "Did you just flash your federal badge at a sitting state court judge to intimidate this court?" Webb, still emboldened by what he mistook for uncertainty, doubled down on his display of federal supremacy. "Your Honor, I'm simply clarifying the jurisdictional hierarchy that applies to federal law enforcement personnel." Judge Caprio nodded slowly, as if carefully documenting Webb's constitutional violations for future reference. "I see. Agent Webb, since you've questioned this court's understanding of federal jurisdiction and constitutional law, let me ask you some questions about your case and your understanding of the law you claim to represent." The judge opened a thick constitutional law volume that had been resting on his desk throughout the proceeding. "Agent Webb, you mentioned federal supremacy doctrine. Can you explain to this court the constitutional basis for federal supremacy as established in McCulloch v. Maryland?" Webb hesitated, sensing he was walking into a carefully constructed constitutional trap. "Your Honor, federal authority generally takes precedence over state authority in matters of law enforcement." "That's not what I asked, Agent Webb. Can you explain the specific constitutional principle established in McCulloch v. Maryland and how it applies to your traffic violation?" Webb's confident demeanor began cracking as he realized he was being systematically outmatched by someone who knew constitutional law far better than he did. "Your Honor, I believe the principle is that federal law supersedes state law." "Agent Webb," Judge Caprio interrupted, his voice gaining authority, "McCulloch v. Maryland established that federal law is supreme only within the scope of federal constitutional authority. It does not establish that federal employees are exempt from state laws that fall within legitimate state police powers. Traffic safety is explicitly a state police power under the 10th Amendment." The arrogance began draining from Webb's face as he realized he was being constitutionally dismantled by a judge who understood federal law better than he did. "Furthermore, Agent Webb, you claim that federal agents operate under different legal frameworks. Are you familiar with the Supreme Court decision in United States v. Bass, which specifically addresses the scope of federal law enforcement authority?" Webb's mouth opened and closed as he realized he was completely out of his constitutional depth. "I'll take your silence as confirmation that you're not familiar with that precedent. United States v. Bass establishes that federal law enforcement authority does not exempt federal agents from state laws that are within state constitutional powers when those agents are acting outside their official federal capacity." Judge Caprio pulled another document from his file. "Agent Webb, since you flashed your federal badge at this court and claimed federal supremacy, I took the liberty of contacting the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility regarding proper protocol for federal agents appearing in state courts. Webb's face went completely pale. He clearly hadn't expected his federal supervisors to be contacted. According to FBI Policy Manual Section 5.4.2, federal agents are explicitly required to comply with all state and local laws when acting in their personal capacity. Were you aware of this policy, Agent Webb? The courtroom fell silent as Webb realized the scope of his professional and legal miscalculation. Your Honor, yes. But I thought... Furthermore, Agent Webb, according to the FBI's Professional Responsibility Unit, flashing federal credentials to intimidate state judicial proceedings constitutes abuse of federal authority and conduct prejudicial to the government. Does that sound familiar from your professional training? Webb tried to speak, but Judge Caprio continued with devastating precision. The FBI's Professional Standards Manual specifically states that federal agents who attempt to use their federal status to avoid accountability under state law are subject to disciplinary action up to and including termination. Did they teach you that at Quantico, Agent Webb? Webb's federal arrogance had completely evaporated, replaced by genuine fear as he realized his career was under direct attack. Your Honor, I never intended to abuse my authority. Agent Webb, intent is irrelevant. You flashed your federal badge at a state court judge while claiming exemption from state law. That's textbook abuse of federal authority. Judge Caprio's voice grew stronger, carrying the full weight of his judicial authority. You suggested that your 18 years of federal experience gave you superior understanding of constitutional law. You insulted this court's knowledge of federal jurisdiction. You demonstrated the exact kind of federal arrogance that undermines public trust in law enforcement and threatens the constitutional balance between federal and state authority. Agent Webb, not only am I finding you guilty of the school zone violation and imposing the full $400 fine plus court costs, but I'm also finding you in contempt of court for attempting to intimidate this court with federal credentials. Webb's expression transformed from arrogance to shock. Furthermore, Agent Webb, I'm directing court administration to forward a complete transcript of today's proceedings to the FBI's Office of Professional Responsibility, along with my judicial finding that you attempted to use federal credentials to obstruct state judicial proceedings. The courtroom buzzed with reactions as Webb began comprehending the implications for his federal career. But, most importantly, Judge Caprio continued, standing at his full judicial authority, I'm recommending that the Department of Justice review your fitness to represent federal law enforcement, given your fundamental misunderstanding of constitutional jurisdiction and your documented abuse of federal authority. Webb looked devastated. Your Honor, you can't destroy my federal career over a traffic ticket. Agent Webb, I'm not destroying your career. You destroyed your career the moment you decided to flash your federal badge at a state court judge while demonstrating constitutional ignorance and a federal supremacy complex that has no basis in law. Judge Caprio walked closer to the defendant's stand, his constitutional authority fully displayed. Agent Webb, let me share something with you about federal authority and constitutional law. I've been practicing law for 45 years. I've handled federal cases, constitutional appeals, and jurisdictional disputes. I've worked with federal agencies, federal prosecutors, and federal judges. I understand federal authority better than agents who think their badges make them constitutional scholars. The judge's voice took on the tone of a constitutional law professor addressing a failing student. The Constitution doesn't establish federal supremacy over everything, Agent Webb. It establishes limited federal authority within specific constitutional boundaries. When you're speeding through a school zone in your personal car on your way to a dentist appointment, you're not exercising federal authority. You're violating state law like any other citizen. Webb stood frozen, his earlier federal swagger completely destroyed. You walked into my courtroom today thinking you could intimidate a state judge with your federal badge and your 18 years of experience. Instead, you've demonstrated exactly why some federal agents are dangerous. They confuse their investigative authority with constitutional immunity. Judge Caprio returned to his bench, preparing to deliver his final constitutional judgment. A federal agent who shows disrespect for state judicial authority is the same agent who shows disrespect for constitutional boundaries. An FBI agent who thinks traffic laws don't apply to him is the same agent who thinks constitutional limits are suggestions rather than requirements. The judge picked up his gavel. Agent Webb, your $400 fine is now $900 with court costs. Your contempt citation carries an additional $500 penalty. But most importantly, you'll be explaining to the Office of Professional Responsibility why a state court judge has serious concerns about your understanding of constitutional authority and federal-state relations. Webb's voice was barely audible. Your Honor, please. I'm not finished, Agent Webb. You mentioned that your federal badge carries more weight than local traffic enforcement. Let me tell you what carries real weight in this constitutional system. Respect for the law, understanding of jurisdictional boundaries, and recognition that no badge, federal, state, or local, exempts anyone from constitutional accountability. Judge Caprio looked out at the packed courtroom, which included several federal agents who had come to observe their colleagues' hearing. Let this be a lesson to every federal law enforcement officer watching. Your badge represents service to the Constitution, not supremacy over it. Your oath is to support and defend the Constitution, not to exempt yourself from the state laws that operate within constitutional boundaries. He looked back at Webb, who stood with his head bowed in complete humiliation. Agent Webb, I strongly recommend that you spend some time studying the constitutional principles you've sworn to uphold. Federal authority is not unlimited authority. Federal badges do not grant immunity from state law, and federal agents are not above the constitutional system they've sworn to serve. Judge Caprio raised his gavel. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down with finality. As the courtroom emptied, Webb stood alone at the defendant's table, staring at the citation that had just cost him $1,400 and, almost certainly, his federal career. The federal superiority complex that had carried him through 18 years with the FBI had been systematically dismantled by a 76-year-old state court judge who never raised his voice. Assistant Special Agent in Charge Patricia Morrison, Webb's direct supervisor, had been sitting in the gallery throughout the entire proceeding. She approached Webb as he gathered his belongings, her expression reflecting both professional disappointment and constitutional embarrassment. Agent Webb, she said quietly, I watched that entire hearing. That judge just gave you a masterclass in constitutional law that you clearly never learned at Quantico. Webb looked up at her, his earlier federal confidence completely shattered. SAC Morrison, I didn't think it would escalate like that, Marcus. This is exactly the kind of federal arrogance that undermines our relationships with state and local law enforcement. You just embarrassed the entire Bureau by demonstrating constitutional ignorance while wearing our badge. As Webb walked out of the courthouse, reporters who had witnessed his constitutional destruction followed with cameras. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues who had watched the live-streamed proceedings. The video of his federal humiliation would be viewed over 3 million times within 48 hours. Within days, the Office of Professional Responsibility opened a formal investigation into Webb's conduct and constitutional competence. The transcript of his courtroom behavior, combined with his public display of badge intimidation, led to immediate suspension pending disciplinary review. 3 weeks later, Webb was summoned to appear before the FBI's disciplinary board. The recording of his constitutional ignorance and badge-flashing incident, combined with Judge Caprio's judicial finding of federal authority abuse, painted a picture of an agent whose arrogance posed a genuine threat to federal-state relations and constitutional governance. The board's decision was swift and decisive. Webb was terminated from federal employment. His security clearance was revoked. He was barred from future federal law enforcement positions. The FBI issued a formal apology to Judge Caprio and the Rhode Island state court system. Former Agent Webb's attempts to find employment in law enforcement over the following months proved futile. No federal agency would consider hiring him due to his constitutional violations. State and local law enforcement agencies rejected his applications based on his documented abuse of authority and disrespect for judicial proceedings. Years later, Webb would tell law enforcement students at a private security training program, "Judge Caprio didn't end my federal career to humiliate me. He ended it to protect the Constitution from agents who think their badges make them above the law. He taught me that federal authority, without constitutional understanding, is just federal tyranny with a badge." The video of that Monday morning became one of the most watched federal accountability moments ever recorded, shared millions of times across social media platforms. Federal agencies around the world used it as training material about the importance of constitutional boundaries and respect for state judicial authority. But for those who knew Judge Caprio personally, it was simply another example of what made him exceptional: the ability to defend constitutional principles with dignity, to educate through justice, and to transform federal arrogance into constitutional accountability. He proved that state judicial authority is not inferior to federal law enforcement power. It's a co-equal branch of government that serves as a crucial check on federal overreach. In a time when federal-state relations are often strained, Judge Frank Caprio demonstrated that constitutional governance works best when everyone, federal agents included, remembers that no badge grants immunity from the law, no authority is unlimited, and no government employee is above the constitutional system they've sworn to serve and protect. The badge and the bench had met that Monday morning. The badge lost not because it lacked power, but because its bearer had forgotten that in America, the Constitution and the judges who interpret it stand above all badges, federal or otherwise.